All right, all right. So let's dive into the history. So this week I read a book, well, a biography called Bonnie Raitt, Just in the Nick of Time by a guy named Mark Bigo. And so now we're going to start the story though way back, about 50 years before the birth of Bonnie Raitt, and we're going to go back to November 1st, 1898 in Jefferson County, Arkansas, where a woman named Sippy Wallace was born.
Damn.
So Sippy Wallace plays an integral part of the Bonnie Raitt story, from her main inspiration to start playing music to the inspiration for a lot of her nonprofit work.
She eventually trademarked and made her riches off of that plastic cup for kids, right?
Right. Good night, folks. That's it for us. So Sippy Wallace is this old blues musician. She moved to Texas as a child. She started singing and playing in her church's choir. She gets married, moves to Chicago, and she starts recording blues music in, get this, 1923. So these are the old recordings where the hiss on the record is sometimes louder than the performance itself. But just for some fun context, we're going to drop in a clip of one of those really early singles called I'm a Mighty Tight Woman. I threw that on the playlist. If you guys just picture, it's like, the horns. It sounds like something from the 1920s.
Someone's wielding a phonograph crank to listen to it.
That horn, yes. So Sippy Wallace was actively recording until 1929. And then she basically became a singer and a pianist in a Baptist church for like 40 years. She was eventually coaxed out of retirement by another old blues singer. And in 1966,
For 1 second, I thought you said coked out of retirement. No,
that might have been the only thing that got her on stage in the 60s.
I want to be coached out of
Tarnishing,
retirement. That's a life goal now, Phil.
tarnishing this woman's reputation, Phil. My
sorry,
God.
sorry.
So she was in her late 60s in 1966, and she cut an album. And sorry, she cut an album in 1966 called Woman Be Wise at the age of 68. You see, it's never too late. So I'm planning my big hit in about 24 years, and I'm going to write that masterpiece album. All right. So you guys set your calendars, set an Apple calendar reminder. All right, now we're going to jump forward to Bonnie Raitt. Okay, it's November 8th, 1949. She is born in Burbank, California. Bonnie Lynn Raitt, a second,
Wow.
yeah, a
Such
second
blues
generation.
credentials over there.
I was going to say, she's got a Scottish background. She was not from the Mississippi Delta or Texas, which I kind of always assumed when you hear these blues singers, but she is totally a Southern California girl. She was the middle of an older brother and a younger brother, and she grew up a tomboy. Her mother was a piano player, pretty accomplished, and her father was a big Broadway star, a guy named John Raitt, who was huge in Broadway in the 40s and 50s. So
Yeah, I
music
feel
was,
like I've heard that name. I didn't know this is her father.
yeah, her father. And I think Carousel was the big uh, musical that he was known for, that he kind of made his stardom in.
Oh, nice. You'll never walk alone. It's a jam.
I don't know that one. I
I
know.
think that's from Carousel. You definitely know the song.
All right, all right. We'll drop that in here now. Uh, so music was omnipresent in her house as a kid, but in a familiar turn of touring musicians, John Raitt toured the country with theater groups, and her mother had to give up her dream of being a musician and stayed home to raise the kids. And to hear Bonnie talk about it, she held some animosity for her father because he was never around. And more so, she was angry that her mother went unappreciated for everything that she did. So her so music was the family business. So it's not a huge surprise that Bonnie got into that. Her parents really, really pushed her and encouraged her to get into it. And growing up, Bonnie was in awe of her father from the time that she was able to even realize that he was a musician. That was his job. And she was mesmerized by that idea. But along with being enamored with her father, she quickly became disillusioned with him because he was gone a ton. He wasn't around enough to be a real father. Now, later, she'd come to appreciate how hard it was to do what he did, but she eventually learns that touring itself is kind of like an addiction.
Touring, rambling. It's pretty much the same thing.
Gotta ramble, gotta tour. So Bonnie gets her first guitar as a Christmas gift in 1957. at 8 years old, and it was a Stella acoustic guitar. And she never took
Love those
guitar.
things.
The Stellas
Classics.
are great. If you're
Yeah.
looking to buy your kid a guitar, the Stella is a great choice, I think.
Well, that one has resonance for us because Phil had that Stella for years and years. It was a little 3/4 size, or even
Yeah.
maybe even smaller than that, right? That they kicked around all the rental houses in college, right?
Yes, correct. And it was definitely a little nuisance maker, but Tom particularly hated it.
Does it still survive to this
No,
day? Or
Tom
been,
destroyed it long
all
ago.
right.
Tom just hates joy, so
Yeah.
What's bringing joy? Let me destroy it.
Yeah. He's like the Grinch at the beginning of the movie.
No redemption story. It just him being an
Yeah,
asshole, and then
yeah.
it ends. Merry
Yeah, yeah, he just goes to the top of Crumpet, and everyone cries, and he goes great, and goes home and eats the candy.
gains power from their tears.
So she teaches herself to play, all self-taught. And it was really during the folk music revival of the late 50s and early 60s. So think of all the beatniks. She said that at 11 years old, she was wearing peace symbols and olive green pants with black turtlenecks and grew her hair out. So very young, she was into this scene. And she would go away to summer camp again during the same time of this big folk revival. And she was asked to start performing at her summer camp. So this was kind of her spark. Now, the absence of her father as she's growing up obviously doesn't help. But her father recounts that when she was 13, he was on the road. He'd come home and she would cry to him and say, "You're never home. Why can't you be like other dads?" And this is heavy. He says, "You'll find out sometime that daddy has to go where his talent is wanted. And you'll find out that someday this happens in your life." Whoa.
Whoa.
Because we'll find out later on that she never stops touring. I mean, she was basically playing gigs for, I mean, now it's probably been 55 years or something like that. So at the scene, we're talking, it's the mid 60s. She really didn't fit into that California beach surf rock culture. She didn't really like the music. She's a redhead. She wasn't hanging out in the sun. She was pale. She was going to burn. So in 1964, she started to get out of that beach layout, the beach scene, and dove into folks like Tina Turner, Joan Baez, Aretha Franklin. And early on, she was convinced that she needed to save the world. Her parents were Quakers. She was a pacifist, and her parents were very political. So she grew up thinking that part of her career needs to be political at some point, but she's really got to save the world. That's kind of like her second mission.
Political Quakers? That's a thing?
Yeah, well, it might have just been the pacifistic, if that's a word, the pacifist,
Yeah. Okay, fair
side
enough.
of it. So maybe more just like anti-war, pro-peace stuff. All right, so we've got a Scottish redhead, the daughter of a Broadway star living in the Hollywood Hills in California. So how the hell does she get into the blues? Well, the magical album that changed her life was around 14 years old, and she heard Blues at Newport 1963. And it was on this album that she hears John Lee Hooker, Sonny Terry, Mississippi John Hurt, a ton of other blues legends. But there was also this guy named John Hammond Jr. that stuck out the most to her because he played slide. She absolutely loved that sound. She thought the slide sounded like a human voice, like it was taking a guitar and making it into a human voice. And her grandfather also played lap steel. So it reminded her of that sound. So she, at an early age, starts kind of gravitating toward that slide sound. And at 15, she starts playing slide. Now, at the same time, she goes to the Troubadour, she goes to the Troubadour and they have an amateur night once a week. And she and a friend get up and start playing. And this is kind of like her first gigs. Now, unlike a lot of other stories, there's no big record execs there. She doesn't get picked up by a label. But her family picks up in 1965 and they move out of California and they move to Poughkeepsie, New York. And she goes to college at a place called Radcliffe in Massachusetts in 1967. So she starts going to college. And again, no big surprise. She starts putting most of her efforts into music and she starts gigging because she's getting paid. And there's a quote where she said, "Once you get paid for doing something you love to do anyway, it's pretty hard to turn around and have to go back to school." So she
I,
falls in love with God.
Well, I have a question. I was just wondering if you got any indication of. You're talking about 1965. This is boy band Beatles. This is Sunshine and Lollipops Beach Boys.
Pre
The
Woodstock.
blues, yeah, pre Woodstock, pre electric blues generally, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm guessing that blues music, although it had been around for quite some time and it had clearly influenced rock and roll and Chuck Berry and Little Richard and things like that, was it pretty niche to be a John Lee Hooker fan, for instance?
I think it probably was. And this is, you're right, this is not electric blues. This is a lot of the acoustic driven blues. So she falls in love with that album, basically starts covering it. And as she's doing gigs, again, it's niche enough that there was a record promoter, a blues promoter, who saw her at one of these small gigs. And I don't know if he just thought she was a novelty or actually really dug what she was doing, but he started putting her in front of some of these old Delta blues players as
Hmm.
they started touring. So she was now opening for Buddy Guy. She's opening for Junior Wells. So
Interesting. Because
she
I,
started.
well, yeah, no, because I think just to like tie some strings together and just sound it out, my understanding had been this is an oversimplification, but that the British invasion was sort of about British kids getting a hold of those American blues records at a time when American blues players were not really getting their due in America and popularizing it in Britain and sort of repackaging it, sending it back to America via the British invasion, which then elevated their status.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so maybe she's doing this while that's going on over there and it's still kind of simmering under the surface. Because we'll find out that she does go on to actually start a foundation where she raises money to pay for a lot of these old blues singers from the 20s, 30s, and 40s who basically got screwed
Right.
out of money and had written all these songs. And she started a nonprofit to help give some money back and to recognize a lot of these
Uh,
forgotten blues players.
no, that's really cool. And to be clear, not taking anything creatively away from these guys, but my understanding is it just wasn't that popular in America. Maybe that's part of why they were so accessible to her as a young musician, because it was a little more niche. And that when bands like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles kind of re exported it back to America, then America started to pay more attention to that stuff.
Right. So it's around this time that she travels to Europe. I'm not sure why. It might have been for a one or two dates on a gig, but she was browsing around a record store in London and she stumbles across that 1966 release from Sippy Wallace. She's immediately enamored with Sippy Wallace. So Bonnie returns back home to Philadelphia after being in Europe for a little while. She immediately drops out of college and she starts gigging around Philadelphia, and she gets a slot opening for John Hammond Jr., her slide hero. And she also met a band called the Edison Electric Band and befriends their bass player, a guy named Freebo, who would play bass with her for like the next 20 years. So she and Freebo spend the next couple years as a duo, gigging up and down the East Coast and opening for guys like Taj Mahal. Again, she's kind of building this mini kind of cult following on the East Coast. But she's also starting to get noticed by some folks in the industry. And in the spring of 1971, she signed a deal with Warner Brothers, who at the time also had Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, and our favorite Randy Newman. These were the folks on the on the bill with Warner.
I
Now,
think they
her
had
first
Crafton too, or was that later?
that might have been later. Now this is 71. That's a good call. It could have been. I don't know. I'm too lazy to look it up. So her first foray into the recording industry was just called Bonnie Raitt. Rob had mentioned it at the top. That was released in 1971, and she recorded it in the most rural setting she could find. It was the garage of an abandoned summer camp in Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota. And it was recorded on a 4-track, very ramshackle. The book that I read called it very homegrown, and she's 21 at the time. So that first album also just happens to have the song that my wife and I danced to at our wedding. It was our first dance song. It's a song
Oh,
called Thank
that's
You, and I'm going
that's
to
so
drop a
sweet.
clip in here. And I did that A, just because I friggin' love that song, but B, I think it's a good flavor of what Rob and I were talking about earlier, which is it's just cooler. It just has a real nice vibe.
Oh, that first record's great, and it's interesting to hear that that was like essentially, if I'm hearing you correctly, it was like a DIY situation.
Very, yeah. I
It
think
was
they
like
had
a
like $8,000 to produce it or something like
oh,
that.
well, that's actually all
Is
right,
that the
you know.
one?
But
Was that written by Stephen Stills, or is that a different one?
No, so this song, so Thank You is actually written by her.
Oh,
This is,
nice. Okay.
yeah, one of her originals that she had written. Now, on that debut album, she also covered Mighty Tight Woman, the one that we played at the top, and another Sippy Wallace song called Woman Be Wise. And now this album didn't sell very much and it didn't really crack the Billboard charts, but she was starting to build a small but loyal following, mostly through word of mouth. From the start, she was always kind of considered a musician's musician, somebody who could sing and play and perform like a pro. And in 1972, she appeared at the Ann Arbor Blues and Jazz Festival. And it's there that she met and performed with her idol, Sippy Wallace, for the first time. And that same year, she records her second album called Give It Up in June of 1972. So her sound continues to get refined over the course of these albums. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned it yet, but tonight's album is her 10th release. So I'm going to hit some highlights of those albums. I won't go super deep into it, or else we'll be here for 6 hours.
Can we just say that's already impressive? I mean, like I said, the story is a great story. She has persisted. She's still releasing records and touring to this day. But the fact that you have a hit at record number 10,
right, knocking on 40, you're
knocking on 40, it's huge, and it deserves respect, sir.
I mean, she put out a record every year from 69 to 75. And if you go and look at the record she put out in 1975, Home Plate, if you just look at the cover art, you'll understand why it took her 2 years to release the next record. This is a career killer. Holy shit.
Pretty corny.
It's like a drawing of her sliding into Home Plate. It's insane.
Yeah,
it's pretty awesome this even exists. I gotta find a bigger image of this.
We should use that as the title art for this album. It'll just really confuse people.
Yeah, how the heck did that come out in the 70s? That's got real strong 80s vibes.
Yeah, well, it's real forward looking.
Children vibe.
Wow.
Right, it looks like a Nickelodeon show poster. Yeah, it's bizarre.
I'm gonna buy this vinyl.
It's definitely a dollar bin classic.
Holy shit, it's a clip art. It's so awesome. Got a good look at it here now. Anyway, we can move on.
So her second album, Give It Up, entered the Billboard charts at 138, and it sold, a respectable 250,000 copies at the time of its release. And it's around this time as well that she starts to consider part of her mission in life and to use her music and her fame, well, a little bit of fame, as a vehicle for some of those old artists, the pioneers from the 20s and 30s who invented the blues but never really got their fair share or fair hearing, as she calls it. So she goes on at some point later in her career to be a founding member of the Rhythm and Blues Foundation. And they're the ones who do recognition and health benefits for all of these older, underappreciated blues artists.
So she started that early, that in her career, relatively.
Yes, in her 20s.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, yeah, it sometimes goes unnoticed. It's kind of, this is maybe a bad analogy, but it's like the professional athletes from the 1960s. They didn't make nearly as much money as the guys from now did. And, some of them in later life ran out of cash, but you can imagine what it was like for the Sun Houses of the world. Probably never got a payday.
Right. Died homeless and poor,
Jeez.
having been the greatest in the world at one point.
Very noble cause.
So in 1973, she moves back to the West Coast, where she meets and falls in love with a band called Little Feat. Are you guys at all familiar with Little Feat?
Oh yeah.
I wasn't at all. I'd seen the name before, and I went and listened to it. They're pretty badass. I'm not sure if they're on the list, but that would be one that I would look forward to if they were.
Pretty sure they're on there. Yeah.
Nice.
I think so. Yeah.
So she gets in with them and subsequently starts drinking and partying like any other 24-year-old gigging musician should and does. And that same year, she records Taking My Time, and it's released in October of 1973, and she's touring nonstop. And it's at this point in her life that she realized she's turned into her father. She realizes what he was talking about. She's now addicted to performing and being on the road. The girl's got to ramble. So she's becoming very well known in music circles, but still no major commercial success, which she's okay with. And in 1974, Warner Brothers gives her a $10,000 allotment for her next album. Now, Warner Brothers says they'll give her the money, but the fourth album, they need a hit. They need a hit, and she's got to use a producer with a track record of hits. So for 1974 Streetlights, the producer Jerry Ragavoy steered her away from blues and more into the pop realm. And this is the first and only album that she's ever done where she doesn't play any slide guitar on any of the tracks. Now that was released in the sorry guys. Now that was released in September of 1974, and it made it to number 80 on the Billboard. Hey, she's doing all right. She keeps getting better and better. So from this point on, Bonnie drops the naive charm of those early albums and is really considered more of a pro at this point, but she's still not getting any radio play. So up next is 1975's Home Plate. Phil, you were just talking about that atrocious cover. It's her fifth studio album. Now, this is the same year that Linda Ronstadt releases Heart Like a Wheel, which was also her fifth album and was a raging success. The leading track on that was You're No Good. Everyone knows that song. So that's what Bonnie is competing with at this point. And that Linda Ronstadt album and that single went #1 in the Billboard charts. So now Warner Brothers has in the back of their head that Bonnie is going to be the answer to Capitol's Linda Ronstadt. But the two really weren't rivals. They were actually friends behind all the scenes. So for Home Plate, they gathered a who's who of musicians: Emmylou Harris, Jackson Browne, J.D. Souther, who we remember wrote a ton of those Eagles songs from those early Eagles albums. And everyone connected on this project was just sure this was going to be the big breakthrough. And guess what? It makes a bump. It peaked at number 43, but nothing huge. You know, Bonnie's 25 at this point. It's still touring nonstop. Now, in 1976, she goes back into the studio again for album number 6. This one is called Sweet Forgiveness. It's released in 1977. She has a moderate single hit with a song called Runaway. Pretty solid rock tune. Robert Christgau liked it, although he did say rock and roll nostalgia is an accepted way to getting a girl singer on the charts, as Bonnie's friend and rival Linda Ronstadt has proved more than once.
Is that the Del Shannon song? Is that what you're talking about?
Runaway?
A wow, 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 wonder.
Oh, I actually don't know. Hang on.
Why? Yeah, I think that must be what he's talking about. It's a jam.
I'm just curious as to who wrote it.
You guys know the 60s tune I'm talking about?
I do, yeah.
Absolutely.
And I wonder where she will stay.
Well done. Yes. All right. So that album was certified gold for around 500,000 records, and it peaked at number 25. All right. Go Bonnie. You're looking better. We're moving up here. All right. It's 1977, Los Angeles, and it's a time of crazy cross-pollination and partying in the music scene in LA. We're talking people just floating around between studios and sessions. You've got Don Henley, Glenn Frey, Jackson Browne, Bonnie Raitt, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, David Crosby, Stephen Stills, Frank Zappa. I mean, it is just such a musical melting pot going on in LA right now. And we're going to flash forward now to 1979, and Warner Brothers has a producer named Peter Asher who started working with Bonnie to really try to get that next big hit. Peter Asher, by the way, was the one who produced that killer Linda Ronstadt album. So Bonnie records and releases her 7th album called The Glow. And around the same time, she starts holding a bunch of charity and benefit gigs for a musician organization called Muse, which stood for Musicians United for Safe Energy. This was a big anti-nuclear power protest movement. And she was right
like 79. This is like Carter-Reagan election.
And right around the partial nuclear meltdown near Harrisburg, PA with
what was
it? 3 Mile Island.
Island.
Yeah. So out of that comes this big protest movement, and Bonnie is there just doing tons and tons of charity and benefit shows for this organization called Muse. All right, so now she's got the seventh album, The Glow. Warner Brothers did a big push for the album, and again, everyone is sure this is going to be the one that makes her a star. Surprise, it does okay. You know, she hits 30, not a ton of airplay, didn't sell well, only made it to 7-3 on the billboards. She's 30 years old.
She was nominated for a Grammy on.
She was for
that...
Runaway. She was nominated but didn't win that year. So in 1980, she's getting kind of frustrated and decides to spend more time on her political stuff. But that doesn't last very long. So then she goes back into the studio. And in 1981, she self-produces an album called Greenlight, which was entirely rock and roll, great critical success. Rolling Stone says it's her best album to date. Made it up to 32 on the Billboard. Doing pretty well. By the way, I love that as I'm reading this book, it's talking like this is not a successful career. Like she's got what? We're now on her 7th album, and 5 of them have made it into the top 100. That's remarkable. Like,
she's been nominated for a Grammy. She's hanging out with all the cool guys.
Like, would consider this like I've made it. Like, I don't, this whole thing, and I guess maybe retroactively when you look back, you're like, oh, well, you didn't make it to number 1, so you're shit. But my God, like literally any musician would kill for a career like this. Well, maybe not.
But do people ever find the back catalog, you know, if she doesn't put out, you know, let's give them something to talk about.
Right.
Well, it's only because it's written with a retrospective look of where she went after that, right? I mean, it just goes to show you how there's always these next echelons of success. Just being a working musician is a huge success on its own, right?
Yeah, totally. All right, so at this time too, Bonnie starts raising money to make a documentary film about the then 83-year-old Sippy Wallace. All right, so at 33 years old, Bonnie was thrilled that she got some critical acclaim for Greenlight, but Warner Brothers was not impressed. So Bonnie goes back into the studio again, records another album that she was calling Tongue in Groove. She plays it for Warner Brothers. They hate it. They don't like it. They tell her to take it back into the studio, re-record a bunch of stuff, reproduce it. So she does that. She goes back into the studio, re-records a bunch of the songs, remixes it, and the day after she finished the rework, Warner Brothers drops her from their roster. Oosh. And that's a great spot for our favorite segment here, which is Bonnie Raitt by the numbers. All right, we're going to start off with the number 18, and that is the number of studio albums that Bonnie Raitt has released in her lifetime, which is nothing to scoff at. That is pretty spectacular. Next up is the number 20, as in 20 million albums sold over her career, which spans over 50 years. 5 million. 5 million of those 20 million albums were for this album alone as of 2019. Yeah, this one sold 5 million over the course of, 30 years.
Do we have any demographics on who bought this? Because it was not young people, right?
It was definitely not. She was aiming for that baby boomer crowd.
What is the modern equivalent of like Bonnie Raitt? Like what it resonates, what tugs at us that way? But it's also like
it's like Blink 182's comeback tour or something.
Yeah, but it's gotta
like
be
something
more
that's gotta be so tame. Because I was thinking of all the bands that I loved in the early 2000s that went super poppy and stuff. But like, what's something that I loved and they're now just like elevator rock? I can't.
Coldplay. I didn't love Coldplay, but
they kind of started that way too, but they've gotten even more that way. I mean, maybe an edgier answer would be something like the Black Keys. Like, are they really?
Yeah, I heard their new song. That was pretty rough. Yes.
But I mean, to me, it resonates because they still sound pretty good to me. But that's the point, right?
I remember I saw a comedian, it might have been in the early 2000s, and he was saying, when you're getting old, when elevator music sounds okay. Like, yeah, this is decent. I could listen to this.
Yeah, it's got some George Benson going on here.
All right, so now we're fully down the wormhole. I was in the coffee shop the other day, and there was just some like chill background music, and I was like, I know this song. What is this song? It was definitely like a Muzak version of the Sonic the Hedgehog theme song.
Awesome.
Like in the board. and I was like, holy shit.
There you go. You're
But it
40.
was like
Yep.
it was super Muzak-y. And it was great. And I loved it.
That's great.
All right. The number 200, as in over 200, which is the number of benefit concerts she's done over her lifetime. Everything from cerebral palsy research to stopping nuclear proliferation to environmental causes to homelessness. The number one is the number of rap songs Bonnie has appeared on.
No.
Now, don't worry. This was for a celebrity song, like one of those We Are the World things, but it was called Sun City, which was trying to raise awareness about the apartheid in South Africa. And now it was 90s rap, which you had two guys like doing rip rap, rip it doo in the beginning, and then like 50 celebrities all like, we gotta make a change. It was pretty cringy. It's called Sun City. Go listen to it. We'll get it. We'll throw it on the playlist.
I love how ceaselessly she seems to be batting away our complaints with her good citizenship. Like, this is a good human being. She's better than me, certainly, and better than most.
And she clearly started putting in the work when no one was looking, like long ago. Like,
Exactly.
All right, our next number is the number 14. That's the number of record executives who passed on the chance to sign Bonnie in 1988 before she made this album. Yeah, like I get it.
I mean, kind of understandable. It's pretty unlikely you're going to have a hit at this point, but okay.
All right, and the last one is 650, as in $6.50. Not being obsessed with making money. In 1977, Bonnie kept her ticket prices at $6.50, which is about $34 today. Not bad. That's a reasonable amount for a decent acoustic show, which I assume she was doing at the time.
But then Ticketmaster charges you $75 in service fees.
All right, so that would take it up a little bit, yeah. And $6.50, that's nothing, right? Well, hell, that's downright expensive compared to the cost of joining our Patreon. That's right, for about the cost of a beer per month, which is typically all that we ever drink in a month. Anyway,
it's not on this week.
You can join us and all your friends in our exclusive members only section, where we've got some great bonus content like our song battles, where we duke it out and battle with each other over who has the best idea for what's the greatest song of the 80s, of the 90s. You can get all that, as well as keep up to date on everything coming out of the 1001 Album Complaints universe. So once you hear tonight's final vote, head on over to patreon.com/1001 album complaints, or just find the link in the episode notes. All right, when we last left Bonnie, she had just been dropped by her label. It's not looking good. Spoiler alert, you probably already know things are going to get worse. So she keeps gigging, though. She's burning through her own personal savings, paying her musicians out of pocket to keep playing. So she's losing money with each gig. Eventually, she has to drop her band. And at the same time, she broke up with her longtime boyfriend, Rob Fraboni. And she starts drinking and drinking hard.
So before we move on, can you please tell me her boyfriend's name again?
Rob Fraboni.
Thank you.
That's not Freebo, the bass player? Is that a different guy?
It is not Freebo.
Wow.
There's a whole lot of those, though. All right, so she's broke. She's alone. She didn't save the world like she wanted to. And over the course of about 2 years, she gains 40 pounds. And at 36, she's hitting rock bottom. And just at that point, Warner Brothers releases that other album that they shit on 2 years earlier that she re-recorded. So they never released it. They waited 2 years and then released it. They named it 9 Lives and released it to zero fanfare, zero publicity in September of 1986. Only music critics even knew that it was released. So she sinks even further into this depression. And to top it all off, on November 1st of 1986, Sippy Wallace dies on her 88th birthday, all but destroying Bonnie's dreams of producing a documentary about her. This is kind of like Flanders, when everything's going wrong and he asks if the rubble burnt down when his house collapses.
Except Flanders didn't gain 40 pounds from drinking.
Right.
I thought you were going to bring up her second worst album cover, which is the album cover to 9 Lives, which must have been a boosh from the record company.
All right, hang on. I didn't actually look at that.
It looks like a second grader's
Oh yeah.
painting.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I got Aerosmith's Nine Lives. I gotta go.
Oh, that's yeah. You don't want that.
Yeah, you don't want that either.
Nobody wants that.
It's
Oh,
honestly not that much different.
oh my God! How did I miss that this week? That is a
Oh, it's cute.
It's not cute for
it's
a
a
grown person.
this is the cover of like a board book about cats.
Right. That would make perfect sense.
all right, but don't get too sad because there's a prince in her future, at least for a short time. At least for a short time. So in December of 1986, Bonnie is still gigging. She's still doing tours, and she's long been a musician's musician. And she's playing at the Beverly Theater in LA. And a guy named Prince shows up at the show and falls in love with what he sees. So he gets in touch with her and says that he wants to work with her and release an album on his label. So they were supposed to get together in January of 87, but Bonnie has a skiing accident and has 2 months to heal. And during this time, she's really reevaluating all of her life's decisions. And it's during this time as well that she decides to go to Alcoholics Anonymous and has been sober ever since.
That's great.
Good for her. Yeah, that's huge. I sort of read that she, while rambling and touring, being a tour dog all those years, was really into the rock and roll lifestyle and just kind of considered it a badge of honor as a woman to be able to drink these other dudes under the table,
Yep.
and eventually decided that was not a good life plan.
Well, it's very,
and that's the right move.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Rob, that word hagiographic that you've used before, right? Which is, it's going to be on the positive side. It's going to take a positive light on the subject matter. When I read this book, the guy barely skims the surface about her drinking and partying and rocking and rolling. And
Really?
everything I read, same thing, was like she went pretty hard. She went pretty
Well,
hard.
did you read this anecdote about how around this time when she had gained the weight, she was at a show and a fan in the front row passed her a note that,
Yep.
that the review said was one of the most audacious notes in the history of live shows? And it said, "What happened? You got fat. Maybe you should work out or something."
It's like,
He passed that to the artist on stage at a show that you paid for. What is wrong with you?
Yeah, I mean, fuck.
it's like an Indian auntie or an Asian grandmother who did
What-
that. Sorry, I got to
what-
cut that. Uh,
But like, no, well, but I'm reading it in part because apparently it motivated her. That's what I read. That was a motivating factor that she snapped out of it, even though that person was clearly an asshole.
yeah.
But also to bring up classic Chop anecdote where we were finishing our set in Davis, California, and somebody came up and dropped a note at my feet, and it just said, "Dear band, you suck."
I do remember that.
That was great. But you know
What was your reaction? Did you turn around and say, "Play it loud"?
No, yeah, exactly. We were in the last chorus of the last song, and the band had some ups and downs, performance-wise, we can say. But as it happened that night, we actually played well. It was a good night for us. So I think we all kind of looked at it and just laughed. Like we took it in the right mode. There were other nights where that might have created a car accident on the road or something, with us strangling each other. But anyway, people can be jerks.
Yeah, yeah. But she can handle it. She was tough. Growing up with brothers, she always said that she had to like play harder. Literally, like when it came to like football or wrestling, she was always the tough one just to survive with two brothers. So in April of that year, she gets together with Prince and they record some initial stuff, but due to both Prince and her touring schedule, it just didn't work out. And it sounds like she wasn't too upset because he had just kind of pre-recorded some tracks and wanted her to just come in and sing over top of them, and she wasn't really into that. So it doesn't seem like there was a lot of love lost either way. So she wasn't too crushed.
You telling me Prince had a really strong idea of the aesthetic? Wanted to be in control? It's crazy.
Yeah, can't believe it. All right, so she's cleaned herself up. She's lost a ton of weight. She's still playing random gigs at, folk festivals and campgrounds. So it's not, the height of her career. But in 1987, she winds up working with a guy named Don Was, who she had met the prior year in LA. and he fronted an avant-garde rock group called Was Not. I don't know if I'm saying that correct. Are you guys at all familiar with this band?
Well, I learned about them this week when I found out Don Waz's name. His birth name is Donald Fagenson.
Oh,
I just,
I'm finally putting that together, Phil. That's
Yeah,
now I
yeah,
understand.
I mean, he's actually turns out to be a pretty hip guy. I think he like runs Blue Note now or something.
Oh wow, okay.
Like yeah, he's like a he's a very successful music industry individual.
Well, I looked
But
over his production career, and it seems like he specializes in bands past their prime. Like he produced Stones records in the '90s, and like Hootie and the Blowfish in the 2000s.
He found his niche.
Found a niche, sure, yeah. But
So
what cracked me up is that every time he would be referenced, it would say Don Was, parentheses of was, not was. It's just,
yeah, it's like
started to become a
we
tongue
need
twister.
parentheses. Yeah, right.
yeah,
But
he
they
has
were
like an
known.
admin on Wikipedia. He's in there changing his shit.
So that band Was Not. They had a hit with the song "Walk the Dinosaur." Do you guys
Holy
remember that
fuck!
song?
Yes,
Everybody walk
absolutely.
the dinosaur. Dun, dun, dun.
It's one of
Oh
the
It's
yeah, I
a
totally know
songs
that one.
ever.
Yeah.
yeah, it's almost a novelty song.
Yeah.
So, but that meant that he was a successful producer. So Bonnie was thinking that this might work. This guy's got a track record of proven hits. So he and Bonnie wind up working together in 1988 on a Disney tribute album where she sings a couple songs. Baby Mine was another one. I forget what the other ones were. And that's really where the spark of this album happened. So let's dive into this album a little bit. So she
Wait,
and Don, yeah,
quick side project, Phil. We
yeah.
should do a whole album of just Disney covers. What do you say?
That could be really
Let's
fun.
get on this. Yeah, there's some hidden gems in
Yeah,
there.
Arabian Nights crushes. I've always been a huge fan of Arabian. Ooh, there's some really choice stuff on the Encanto
Oh yeah.
soundtrack. If we're gonna go into some new material,
It's
Yeah,
not a
let's just.
Phil. It's not a Phil album though, unless you say we're going to do this in the style of. So
Oh,
Phil,
true.
in
I'm
the
talking
style
full reharmonization. Let's go, Bill
Yeah.
Evans on "Someday My Prince Will Come" type shit.
Uh-huh. Sounds good. Yeah,
yes.
I'm in. Well, let's spec that out. Like we'll get an
Yeah,
email
I'll
thread
get
going.
right on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Folks, write in to 1001 Album Complaints with your Disney recommendation songs. I'm sure won't be any problem getting rights for Disney songs. So she and Don began working on material that would wind up on Nick of Time at Don's home studio. But at this point, she doesn't yet have a label. And as was her MO, she never stopped playing, mainly because that's the only way she was making money. And Don Was would go out and watch her perform, and most of her stuff was just her alone or her and a bass player. And the bass player at the time was this guy named Johnny Lee Shell. Don listened to her, he liked what he heard, and his approach was, and Tom has mentioned this before too, it's like, what makes a good song? If you can strip away everything, right, and you can sing just like the melody, then you've got a good song. And so similar, Don Was said that no matter how cool a track might eventually be, it had to work with just her alone. Now, in 1988, her manager, Danny Goldberg, helped get her signed with Capitol Records, but they were only willing to give her a new artist contract, which must have been real humbling. She's knocking on 40, and they give her the same contract that they would give to like a 17-year-old, like she's some kid. But that actually was kind of a benefit because there's very low expectations. She's coming out of a very low place. So it actually kind of worked out that there's not a ton of pressure on her. So Capitol signs her for $150,000. And just for some insane comparisons, that feels like a lot of money in 1989. But just for comparison, 3 years later, Janet Jackson would sign with Virgin Records for $32 million.
No.
No, that's apples and oranges, but it's still a fun comparison.
That's like Janet era Janet Jackson, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's a lot.
So
more
now
than
she
10
she
grand,
and Don Was set out to make a record that wasn't trying to appeal to 20-year-old rockers or to fans of 1920s era blues singers. No Motown covers, no classic rock covers. She was aiming at baby boomers who, just like her, were looking middle-aged, dead in the eye, and like me. So maybe that's why it appealed to me a little bit. So a majority of this album was recorded over a week. at Ocean Way Studios in Los Angeles in 1988, with a couple other sessions at Capitol Records in LA and also at Arlen Studios in Nashville. And you hear the album, you think a week. Well, Bonnie is a seasoned veteran when it comes to performing. So they already had demos. She is used to rolling into a gig and playing with whoever is there. So they were going in and they were knocking out 2 songs a day. And the band would listen to a demo. They'd say, let's knock this one out. And they were done. So they got in, they got out in roughly a week. And
don't forget, they never had to be bothered to change the synth presets.
Yeah.
So turn it on and go. That's it. Just plug it in and go.
Song 1, setting 1. Song 2, setting 2.
It's just when you turn on the DX7. Don't even touch it. Just start playing. What about the volume? Don't touch it. Just start playing. There were a ton of musicians on this album, too. I think 32 musicians credited in the liner notes, among which were Herbie Hancock, Graham Nash, David Crosby stepped by as well. But for the main players, a majority of the album was done with the occasional Beach Boys drummer, a guy named Ricky Fattar, bassist Hutch Hutchinson, and Johnny Lee Shell. And Johnny Lee Shell also played guitar, and of course, Bonnie doing her signature slide and guitar work along with piano. Now,
I totally missed the Herbie Hancock thing. I missed that track entirely. Damn.
Yeah,
he plays on one track.
Yeah. Which one is it?
It's not on our list. It's I Ain't Gonna Let You Break My Heart.
Right. Yes, that is like the very jazzy ballad one. That makes sense. So this album was...
That dude can comp.
Right. This album was a super success. And, her follow-up from this album was called Luck of the Draw, which had the smash hits Something to Talk About and I Can't Make You Love Me, which to this day is one of my favorite songs. An absolutely amazing song. But here we are, gents. What do you say we dive into some tunes on our deep dive tracks?
Let's do it.